Thanks for taking the time to download this Negotiating with the Power of Understanding live podcast, created for the Knowledge Network of Thunderbird School of Global Management. To find more information on how to be an effective negotiator, please visit Dr. Karen Walsh's online educational series on Negotiating with the Power of Understanding at knowledgenetwork.thunderbird.edu/Walsh. In this series, you'll find a variety of podcasts, online discussions, and other resources that will help you succeed in the toughest negotiations. Learn from global leaders their secrets on negotiations. Online around the world, this is Thunderbird Knowledge Network, negotiating with the power of understanding.
Hello everyone, back to base. This is Maria Iliopoulou at the Thunderbird School of Global Management Studio. Today's topic is how can you negotiate successfully in high-stress work environments? And our guest speaker for today is Dr. Pearson. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
She's an expert with over 20 years of experience on curtailing and containing dysfunctional behavior at work, and she has been cited in over 500 newspapers and magazines. A small sample of her clients is PepsiCo, Dow Chemical, NASA, Cisco, Kraft Foods, and the Islamic Development Bank, as well as Red Cross. Of course, Dr. Karen Walsh, our cross-cultural negotiation expert, and Jadimina Salmantas, lawyer and negotiation advisor, are here today with us to share their knowledge from their field.
Hello.
Hi,
nice
everybody.
to see you.
Thank you all for being here. So the first question to start our discussion for today will be addressed to you.
Okay.
So can you share a little bit on how do you prepare to negotiate during a crisis?
Sure, I'd be happy to. By definition, when you're dealing in a crisis situation, you're dealing where the odds are very high, when you're under extraordinary circumstances, and very often from a corporate perspective, you're also dealing with a lot of press coverage and public interest and so forth. So I think much of what you do in crisis situation is very similar to the way that you would negotiate day to day, but more so. So the intensity is tuned up quite a bit. By that, things like understanding who your key stakeholders are, having a very clear position for the organization, when possible, having one person who's speaking with a great deal of knowledge on behalf of the organization, and surrounding that person peripherally with experts who may need to address certain issues that come up in the negotiation, but putting basically one position forward so that there's not conflict going on behind the scenes within the organization. Certainly when you're working with people who are under duress, which is again part of the definition of what a crisis is all about, you need to be very mindful not only of their interaction, the way they're coming across, how they're feeling and so forth, but also how you're expressing your interests on behalf of the organization. So I think there is opportunity to tune in even more closely to nonverbal behavior, to the type of language that's being used, and then again as the underpinning for this, as the core of this, having a very clear understanding and clear sense of what the position of the organization is, and as well as possible understanding what the positions of your external stakeholders would be.
Does that resonate with your studies?
It resonates a lot with me, and I like working with Chris Pearson here because she has so much to offer us in this particular field. But I'm really interested in how do you find people manage their adrenaline in these kind of high stress situations? And like a lot of what you're talking about sounds very similar to what we talk about in negotiation planning, is that can hijack us in terms of being very realistic about what we're putting forward and how to even understand others as a result. What has been some of your experience with that?
I think the key thing, it's a great question, the key thing to my experience is practice. So again, based on my experience across industries, across organizations, across levels, functions, whatever, in not only helping people prepare for potential crisis, but helping them manage the crisis when it actually hits and helping them deal with the aftermath. The essential thing is this idea of practicing, and it can start out as simply as gathering your senior leaders around the table to talk about what-if kinds of scenarios, and to then kick that up a higher level, so you're actually putting people in situations where they feel some level of duress, some level of tension, some adrenaline rush, and all of that. Classically, this is done most often, I would say, in organizations with people who actually will be the spokesperson for the organization, just to jump to that particular role. So, I've worked with organizations that will bring in cameras and the filming crew and angry, in fact, I've done that in my own simulations with graduate students. We would bring in angry attorneys representing other stakeholders. We bring in angry consumers. We've done it, again, the idea is to simulate that as closely as you can. It may sound on the surface like it would be very hard to get people to jump into a simulation at a level where they do get the adrenaline rush and so forth, but it's really very easy.
Very easy.
So the impact then of having made the effort, having made the investment to actually go through some practice, to go through some simulation, has tremendously powerful positive effect for people who've gone through it. So that when it happens, it kind of hits from two levels. When it happens for real, you have a better sense of the kinds of things I was just answering Maria's question with, what the situation is, what the external stakeholders might be like, what the general perspective of the organization is, and so forth. But you also have the personal experience, so you've been through the adrenaline rush. Practice really does pay off for that.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask a more practical question. So you say practice, they practice with simulations. How often does that happen? Like, how often do you suggest a company should do that? Do you have any example also of a company that does it very well to share?
Oh, sure. And I'll stay in generic area instead of talking about specific companies. But it might be surprising to people, maybe not, but sometimes it's surprising to people that the companies, the types of industries that are best prepared in general for crises are those that tend to put the public most at risk. So airlines, and have public view because of that. Airlines, oil industry, I think that would surprise some people given the negative press that comes out when there's an oil problem or an aircraft accident. But for organizations that are really, to get back to your opening point on that, for organizations that are serious about crisis management and move themselves, progress to the level of doing face-to-face simulations and even kicking it up to some of the dramatic interactions for that. It would be extraordinary to do that every 6 months. So I'd say, and there are organizations that polish that up, I'd say, more often every year. But again, what we're talking about is organizations that are on the high end of crisis preparation. And for organizations more typical day-to-day kinds of things that are in more day-to-day kinds of industries, if you did tabletop scenarios once a year or even once every 2 years, that might be enough. Part of that varies by the level or the speed of turnover of your senior managers and your senior executives. So one of the things you want to be sure of is if in fact you have fairly rapid turnover, you want to be bringing the new people into the fold so they really get it in terms of crisis management. But the really, the dramatization, the ones that I was referring to before where you're bringing in either real external stakeholders or people who are acting as external stakeholders and so forth, you'd be on the high end of preparation if you do that annually.
And have you seen changes in companies after they do the simulation?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no question about that at all. And I wouldn't say so much the changes in the companies because you have to get to that point in the company. So there has to be an embracing of crisis preparation, crisis management, and a willingness to invest the resources to learn about, to follow this evolutionary path. It tends to start with discussions and then tabletop simulations, and then for some companies that are quite advanced in this, it moves to the interactive simulations. So the change happens over that evolution. So it isn't like, oh, you do the simulation, now the company thinks differently. The different thinking of the company precedes the simulation. But for the individuals, the changes are dramatic, just dramatic. So when you've gone through the process of facing angry customers who are, simulations that I've run, for example, you run the crisis management team through a simulated crisis, and you interject new information during the day. You interject new audiences that they have to face during the day and so forth. If you've been through simulation of facing angry media, even if they're actors facing an angry public, dealing with new information as it hits, which is what always happens in a crisis. It's the unforeseen things that catch you in the crisis. They're the most difficult to deal with. So if you've gone through that, definitely you come out a different person in terms of your mindset and your wisdom and your experience, even with just a one-day simulation.
And this very much fits in a classical negotiation teaching about the role of preparation and negotiation.
Yes.
Where in a crisis situation you actually have almost no time or very time limit for preparing for a particular case.
Yes.
So this preparation is actually shifted to the preparation before for general.
Yes.
Let's say in general for a crisis situation, and then as much as you work before, the less time you need then in a particular case.
Yes.
And that's very much fits in a classical teaching of negotiation, where it's promoted that preparation is crucial for your performance and result.
Yes, yes, and your point is really well taken on a fundamental issue in terms of crisis management. When you face a crisis, you're always doing a trade-off between certainty and time. And so the more you can build on the side of certainty, things you know, things you know about the company's values, things you know about fellow team members on the crisis management team and so forth, you're getting a better balance there because you're going to have to make quick decisions. I mean, it's all about making timely decisions with recognition that you're never going to have the full set of information, the full amount of data that you'd like to have. So that trade-off, your point is really well taken on that. The preparation builds the certainty side on that trade-off balance.
Speaking of certainty, how does the role of the law fit into this in terms of lawyers wanting to always protect, never apologize, always have a protective voice around all of this? How do you work both the legal side, legal protection, and also build trust with the public by being seen as being understanding and responsive?
That's a great question, and I will tell you the first thing that pops into my mind, and I'm generalizing very broadly, is that when you work with the senior execs, and I'm speaking now from an organization that perhaps hasn't made investments in crisis management yet, really, of any significance. So very often my role is to enter the organization, figure out where the senior executives are, and how you're going to bring that group together so that you have a prepared crisis management team. And what I'm sort of laughing about is the toughest one to deal with almost always is the attorney. Because the perspective that I take for crisis management, and as do colleagues around the world that study crisis management, we're a small group actually, study crisis management from an organizational perspective. The perspective we take is to tell the truth and tell it quickly. And the tell it quickly is the part where the attorney's going to say, no, we want to get this locked down. It's not that I'm not suggesting in any way the attorney's going to say they want you to lie, because that part we agree on. The tell the truth part is generally there. But it's hard to, the attorney is one of the most challenging members of the senior exec team generally, to bring to the place of understanding why you would want to share information before you absolutely have to. So that's the place where it's the first challenge. Then when things really hit the road, that you've really got a crisis happening, just as you framed it, the attorney's goal is to protect the organization. So you have to do the mindset shift to recognize that over time, that protection is not this kind of protection. It's a bigger picture protection.
But I would say that in general, lawyers' function and mission in an organization is kind of crisis management before it happens. So any evaluating of legal risk of any particular move is part of the job or a main task they have. Either it's concluding of contracts or doing negotiation on behalf of the company. It's more or less about risk, and that you can see from typical contract structure where reps and warranties are coming usually even in front of the contract. that means it's actually about the risk management and about the crisis management. So what happens in a crisis situation with lawyers? They get lost completely because they probably not presume that situation or not thought about that. And each single move, each single thing can have legal implications from their perspective. So what they do, they just hide themselves and say, no, we do anything. And that blocks probably everything. Yeah. That's a typical lawyer's reaction.
Oh, and what's interesting, too, as you describe that, I love the way you describe that. I wouldn't have even been quite as openly critical of that. It's true, though. What you said is true. It's not because there's any falsehood to it at all. What you find, though, is once you've got a crisis management team that is pulling together, the attorney becomes one of the most valuable assets, no question, because that person does have the mindset to think through, okay, what's the what if? What's the worst case what if? And many other disciplines that will come to the table as the senior managers, that's just not part of the way they've been trained. So I think the toughest part, and we may be going well beyond what your question was looking for there, Karen, but the toughest part is getting the attorney as an active, engaged member, recognizing that there's a give and take to this in the planning stages. Now, if you haven't done that work, then, and you don't have a crisis management team together and you have never been through any of this, then I think you're going to have real trouble in terms of how this will fold out. And we see this in crises of national or world notoriety where they wait too long to put the information out there, and that's often the voice of the attorneys, and not just the attorney, but that's the mindset of saying, if we can keep it close at hand, we can manage it. And we know today, gosh, anybody with a cell phone is potentially a reporter, and so you can't operate from that mindset anymore.
But that includes the question about a negotiation inside the company before you negotiate outside. So in a crisis situation, the inside negotiations are probably much difficult and much more complex than outside.
They're both. They can both be really, because what can happen from the outside is that somebody can come in with an argument or a way they present the argument that you could never have dreamt of, even if you went through crisis preparations. And I'll give you a really quick example with a chemical company that I worked with. They had a minor, wasn't even a major thing, and it's been a number of years, but it's graphic for me for some reason. And they had a group that was protesting and wanted to come in and talk to the senior execs. So they kind of held them at the door for a while. This was at corporate headquarters. And finally they decided, okay, the best thing to do after they did the talking inside, negotiated inside, was to let the externals in. Well, by the time that had passed, they had brought people who were deeply appealing to public interest. They had someone who was in an old-fashioned nun's habit. They had someone who was in a wheelchair. They had little children. They had, I mean, it was so totally staged. And the media were there too. So you never know what's going to come from the outside. Part of the value of going through crisis preparation is so you've got a much better idea of what's going to come from the inside. And I think that was back to your question earlier too. Part of the idea of working through simulations, starting at tabletop level but then getting into more dramatic ones on your own time with your own people, is at least getting a sense of how people are going to react in that kind of a situation. And it can really fool you. It can really surprise you.
Go ahead. And this aligns a lot. What we've been looking at is the interest-based, finding all the mutual interests, the business interests, as well as the rights-based solution to protect your rights and to protect yourself in that situation. What are some tips that can help people remember that these things are not mutually exclusive when we're going through a crisis or even in any internal negotiation? What have you learned over time, or some of those tips to help people remember that?
To remember, give me the run again on remembering that it's
rights-based and also interest-based, that we can both protect our interests, but we can also protect our rights, that we can be advocates to protect ourselves as well.
Well, again, the central thing for this, in my view, if I'm understanding your question correctly, the central thing is to have the dialogue internally. So, you're taking some time, and I'll link in Maria's earlier question. I don't know of an organization anywhere, even I'll take it to the level of sole proprietor, that is immune from doing or should be left out in terms of thinking about crisis preparation. And if we start at the lowest, I mean in size, the lowest level in terms of sole entrepreneurs and that kind of thing, good entrepreneurs do that. They think about the what ifs all the time as they're developing their business and so forth. Crisis management takes you to thinking about the really bizarre what ifs. I mean, that's I think, the difference between just doing strategic planning and thinking about crisis management planning. That's one of the differences. So part of it is recognizing no matter what the size of your firm, no matter what the industry you are in, you should be devoting at least a little bit of time to thinking about what's the worst case scenario for us. And not just thinking about it, again, let's think about small firms, not just thinking about it as the person who's the leader, the founder, CEO, president of the organization, but sharing that discussion. The benefits that can come from bringing issues to the table in terms of crisis management are just invaluable to think about. Invaluable, not only to get diverse perspectives of the people who might be around the table, but also to get buy-in from those people so that you have a shared understanding of where you're going forward and why. And one of the things I've been talking a lot about the senior management team, but the other thing that's really essential is to bring operators into that discussion as well. So I'm probably going a ways off from the question you started with, but around shared interests, that needs to not just be the way the president's looking at the situation, but also informed others, starting with the senior exec team, but also others out in the field and so forth who have a better sense of consumer reactions and so forth.
Yeah, that's even deeper than I was thinking of there.
And that very well reflects how complex is that preparation for the actual negotiation in crisis situations, where the, let's say, legal implications only a piece of the pie, and then you have operational, technical, social implications.
Absolutely.
And that means you, in a crisis situation, you kind of have a short time to shoot all of them in different directions, but it's coordinated.
Yeah.
So if you're not prepared, then you're just shooting desperately in all the directions.
That's exactly right. Or you shoot in, I mean, I haven't thought about that analogy, but I think it works pretty well. Or you shoot in one direction and all this other stuff's going on that you're not even aware of, and you don't have anybody ready to respond to the rest that's coming, that will inevitably come into making it a more complex crisis situation. And there are a number of cases, not tons of them, but there are a number of cases that are out there through Harvard Business School and elsewhere that you can look at crisis situations. It's really simple once you begin to get a crisis management mind frame to look at where the holes were or where there wasn't somebody who was prepared to respond to it. I mean, it surfaces even in even through media coverage as crises evolve around us. It's that's another place where you can focus some of your organizational attention and discussion, even if you're doing what if about a situation that's happened recently somewhere outside your industry or within your own industry.
Allow me to switch the discussion a little bit to another topic. So could you share with us what is the cost of bad behavior in negotiation power when we are talking about teams within the workplace?
Sure. Let me do a little more of a segue because people might wonder, why am I jumping from crisis management situations to bad behavior? For me, it's on a continuum of the dark side of the organization. So we've been talking so far about the crisis management side, which is things like executive kidnapping and workplace homicide and product tampering and all those kinds of things. Where you're asking me to go now is the other end of that continuum, which is just the uncivil or the disrespectful behavior that happens day to day. Much more frequent occurrence, but much finer intensity than the kinds of things we're switching from. So the cost for negotiation, and you can think about this from your own context, I'm sure. In fact, I don't think I've ever encountered anybody in an interview who couldn't come up with a time they were treated badly at work, whether it was by the boss or by a colleague or by a subordinate or whatever. The cost for negotiation is that you're eroding trust. And we see it in the data we've collected for the last decade in regard to cooperation. We have some experimental studies that Chris Porath, who's a colleague of mine at Georgetown, that she has run that absolutely says by all measures that are typically used from an academic perspective to measure cooperation, and trust within a group, those things are eroded when bad behaviors occurred. The interesting thing, just to add on this, is it's not necessarily bad behavior that might have occurred between you and I, but if Karen had been a part of our team and she knew about bad behavior that had happened to you, it will affect Karen as well, even though the bad behavior was not addressed at her. Or if she watched us interact badly, it will affect Karen as well. So anyway, to get back to your question, it's an erosion of trust that is the primary undermining that happens when bad behavior occurs. And again, bad behavior being just people treating each other disrespectfully in the workplace. And what happens then is that you're not bringing you're not bringing a cooperative being to the negotiation table. So if you're working through a negotiation as a team, you're trying to figure out how to get something accomplished or how you're going to create the next innovation or whatever, it's eroded terribly by bad behavior. And the bad behavior, again, doesn't have to be within the team. If it's within the team, you can get to a place where you don't even have enough cooperation to act as a team, and you begin to then see splintering and so forth. But if there's bad behavior in the organization in which the team works and in which the team is supposed to cooperate, that alone can offset the trust level and the cooperation level.
So what is then, we're seeing that the trust and the cooperation is eroded. What is the impact of bad behavior in crisis management?
Boy, you are making two gyrations all over here. That's a great question. Okay, the impact of bad behavior in crisis management would be much the same. One of the things we haven't talked about, and this is from an observation. I wouldn't say so much pure research, counting the data kind of thing, but observation is the best crisis management teams bring authentic people to them. So you bring your whole effort, you bring who you really are, and one of the reasons that it's useful to practice as a team is so that I understand how you're going to react on a certain type, or I can get a good sense of that, whatever. If bad behavior is there within the crisis management team, you're not going to bring your authentic self. You're certainly not going to bring your best self in terms of thinking about cooperation and best alternatives and so forth. You may rise above it for a while because we all know how to work under duress. That's how we get to success in our jobs and so forth. There's, again, nobody that I know of that hasn't faced some kind of bad behavior that I've ever spoken with. But you're eroding the trust and the understanding and the cooperation that you've built to that point if you're operating as a crisis management team and there's been bad behavior. In terms of bad behavior in crisis management in general, so not just within a crisis management team, but in a situation where you're facing a crisis, when there's bad behavior going on from any of the constituencies, again, it's going to undermine the ability to correct the situation, to resolve the crisis as quickly or as well as possible.
And let me put it in a lower level. Let's say you just want, like, a company is interested in introducing change.
Okay.
So this bad behavior, how do you see that it influences people in accepting this change from a manager that has shown bad behavior?
Wow. Okay. It's another twist here. It's a really good question.
Our podcast here.
We don't line up. I mean, if you're talking about, so let's get this nailed down just a little bit more in terms of the scenario you're asking me to think about. So a manager's looking to bring about change in his or her own organization, and that individual has behaved badly toward the people who he or she wants to change. Oh, you've got an impossible scenario. Impossible. I mean, just absolutely impossible. It's another reason, it's a great question because it's another reason why people who are in leadership roles, formally or otherwise, really need to behave respectfully to the people that they work with. What we have found over the years that we've been looking at the impact, the various costs of bad behavior, is that people tend to come out of a bad behavior situation with any one or a combination of three emotions: sadness, anger, and fear. And each one of those has a different impact in terms of how they would reject the change, how they would work against the change. But I can tell you the initial is a negative emotional reaction, and then there are behavioral reactions that follow depending on what the emotion is. So at the end of the day, people get back. In fact, again, we've got a database of more than 8,000 at this point, and there is absolutely no question to what I'm about to say. At the end of the day, when bad behavior occurs, people get back at their organizations, and people get back at the person who caused the bad behavior. So if the supervisor or manager is trying to implement the change, and he or she has behaved badly to people that are subjects to the change, targets of the change, it's never going to happen is the easiest way to say that. Or it'll happen in ways that the manager or supervisor thinks that there's success, but it's being undermined in ways that may not surface even for a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. But it will spoil the effort.
So let's say, let's say a manager has not been very careful so far and has shown some bad behavior. Is there any solution?
Sure. Change the behavior. Change, as the manager, change the behavior.
Can people trust and
Yeah, it
switch?
takes time. I mean, you probably from previous discussions that you've had already for this, you know, once you erode or corrode trust, building it back takes time.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't going to happen overnight, but you know, what we recommend generally, if people are wanting to change their own behaviors, to understand what, you know, how they're being perceived as behaving badly, and make a commitment, work with a coach. I mean, there are all sorts of steps to that we could talk through. But yeah, it's going to take a while, and you need to recognize that. You need to recognize that people aren't going to turn around right away on how they perceive you, because you've set a path there from first impression level that's, you know, not one where they're being protective of themselves. And so it takes a while. It does take a while to get beyond that. But yeah, you can get beyond it. You can. But it's got to be sincere. Mm-hmm. And I would say in most cases it will happen more quickly if you have an expert probably in the person of a coach who can help you do that.
Some closing statements from you two?
Yeah, there's so much more that we could talk about here. But it's also very interesting because this happens in negotiation when people are blockers. And oftentimes inexperienced negotiators think that they've got a deal or they've got an agreement or a yes, but there's really blocking going on because there has been this kind of bad behavior, this lack of respect, lack of understanding in the negotiation. So I would also say that just this basic awareness and that mindfulness of your behavior with others is a way to build working trust, and that's an investment every time we either negotiate or are leading in change, a crisis, or just our day-to-day negotiation experience. So I find that that competency of mindfulness has a big payoff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would say that this relates to a lot of the things we've talked about here today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I fully agree. I would say that what I hear today is, and I also think that in a crisis situation, you have such a high intensity of negative emotions from all around and from everywhere, even from your own team, that, let's say, lawyers cannot ever cope with that. I mean, they probably just a part of that contribute. So this is exactly the leadership role and the leadership task and task of the crisis management team to cope with that.
Yeah.
Like, you cannot rely on lawyer coping with the negative emotions in that situation. He probably only contributes to this, as we talked before. Yeah. That's the task of the leaders to do it. And it's part of the preparation. I fully agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you very much for
Pleasure.
today's podcast. I'm just going to wrap up and close this discussion for today. So there are 3 levels of crisis preparation. Correct me if I'm wrong at any point. The first is discussion. So you sit down and you think about the what-ifs to get you prepared for a potential crisis. The second is tabletop. And the third is simulations with more dramatic situation, bringing out especially people from outside, playing roles of angry customers or angry stakeholders. Understanding beforehand the sharing interests, internal and external, is very critical for an organization to be prepared. When you deal with crisis, you always have to balance time and certainty. Mm-hmm. It's relatively simple to manage crisis, actually, when you develop a crisis mentality. And the bad behavior, as we said before, we switched our our subject a little bit to connect it to bad behavior and what implication it has on crisis and change management. The bad behavior actually erodes trust and cooperation. It's never too late to change bad behavior and switch to good behavior, as long as your effort is sincere, and an external advisor would be very beneficial for you to change and rebuild trust with your coworkers and employees. So this is all for today. Thank you very much. See you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Online around the world, this is Thunderbird Knowledge Network, negotiating with the power of understanding.